All right, everybody. Welcome back to Understanding Game Design. My name is Mark Wolf, and in this video, we are going to be talking about game design and medium. That medium is the most important thing in game design. That game design is medium. That's all it's really concerned with. Everything else is going to be branching out from there. So that's why this is the most important topic to start with. At the end of this discussion, I'm also going to go over some ideas for upcoming videos, things I want to make sure I cover here at the beginning for kind of going over things that starting game designers I think should know. So I'm going to talk about all those at the end here. But we're going to talk about medium. So game design starts with medium. Design can even start with medium without an idea. That's why it's the start. You can't really start designing until you're concerned with medium. And what medium is literally just how players play the game, how players are interacting in the competition. And here's kind of like the secret sauce of game design. This is the difference between how game designers think and how players think. Game designers are always and only concerned with the medium. And this is also how you can invent new genres, is you figure out new ways for players to interact. And it might seem strange that this is something as simple as, what's the control scheme on your console that you're designing for? Like what's the button layout? But that's really it. When you're designing an arcade cabinet, you're figuring out what buttons do you want to include, what input devices. But before we get to some more complicated stuff, we're going to tie in medium to the other theory topics that we're going to get into later in our advanced discussion in more applied game design. Because the reason that you're always concerned with medium is because this is how you flesh out full customization of strategy. This is giving you the metrics for balance and fairness. And whether or not you intend to continue designing and iterating on a design, the way that you can expand it, it's expandable due to medium. Whether you intend for it or not, it can be expanded. So you need to be aware of that because there's potential you may be leaving, on the table. So we're going to start here with kind of like a simple example, or as simple of an example as I can think of here. And then we're going to move to some more like complicated kind of playing around with new ideas and innovations and things like that. So we're going to start with Magic the Gathering and thinking about how the medium defines how mechanics are designed. And this is focusing in, of course, on the trading card game. So for Magic, it takes the trading card game and it sets out some basic parameters, some basic, rules and setups for the playfield that define like how Magic is designed. So we're going to go through those. So first, we have the minimum 60 card limit for the deck. And by the way, so this is like a theoretical look at Magic. This isn't an actual historic look because the history of Magic is very different from this, and we're also looking at this more in terms of like theory compliance, which Magic is not. So but we're going to take this as sort of like a loose example. So we have the 60 card deck minimum, 4 cards or 4 copies of a card maximum. You have 20 life. You have a graveyard for discards. Each player can play 1 land on their turn, and they can draw 1 card per turn. There's the different card types. Land is one of those. And then there's other things like creatures have summoning sickness, creatures have power and toughness. There's the timing with the stack and priority for instants and sorceries and things like that. So when we look at the basic framework of Magic, we can see that there's already a lot to look at and a lot to consider for how to flesh things out. And one really important thing to point out when you're designing is that the times when you're going to like run into design stops, like writer's block, things like that, are the times when you're trying to either intentionally or unintentionally deviate from considering the medium. So focusing in on the medium actually helps you solve design problems. And so here's how that happens. So looking at the basic framework of Magic, we can already see that if we can play one land per turn and we can draw one card per turn, we have a basic tempo for the gameplay and how things are going to be costed. We already know we have something to relate those ideas to. But now we can kind of, jump ahead even and start creating mechanics. And we'll get to the color thing in a minute. So covering basic mechanics, we look at our framework and we say, in order to achieve full customization of strategy, we need to give players all of the components, all of the different things they're going to build strategies out of. All of the game pieces in this design are trading cards. So everything that players are going to have as a resource is going to mean, aside from an abstract thing like life, is going to be a trading card. So we have our card types and everything. Now we need to look at how we've set things up and build mechanics to address all of those different things, all of those limited resources. And here too, we can come back to the very first little illustration I did for the first competition video, where you see that the scope of your game is the victory conditions. So we've set that up here with the 20 life, and inside the game, it's the limited resources the players have to achieve conflicting goals. And those are all the mechanics that we're going to offer on the cards. So to start building those, we have to address everything that we've already set up, and then we'll expand from there. So can you bring back a card from the discard pile, from the graveyard? Great. Now you can set up different abilities to target different card types in the graveyard. And you can consider counting things in the graveyard. You need to be able to destroy cards that are in play. You need to be able to return cards that are in play to their controller's hands. You need to be able to make players discard. You need to, now that we have Summoning Sickness, let's create a thing called Haste as a keyword so that we can subvert that in our mechanics. Since we have Life, let's create abilities that can deal direct damage, not just on creatures, but as like spell effects. And we can look at all of these different things and all the ways that they can interact, the different like costs and conditions and triggers and timing. And we're going to build all of those out to create a basic card pool that and also another important thing is, like counter spell, since we're flinging around spells, let's have an ability that can counter that, things like that. So covering your basic foundation for the mechanics to address everything you've initially set up, gaining life, preventing damage, manipulating combat, pumping creatures up, giving creatures minuses, giving creatures not just temporary bonuses, but creating the idea of counters for permanent bonuses within the game iteration. So we have all of these foundational mechanics and all of these cards that we can make. Now we're going to get to the color thing. So think of it sort of like like a tree trunk cross section. You've got a core center, and each ring outward, each successive ring outward, needs to be even and full. So we've got our foundational mechanics. Let's talk about the color pie. So these foundational mechanics, in order to create the flavor of magic, they divide them up into the 5 colors, and they sort them in terms of how strategies are built. Like the concept of dealing direct damage, they'll sort into red. So mechanics that have conditions that can deal direct damage, or effects that can trigger that deal direct damage, or spells that just deal direct damage, all of those things you can create as red cards. And so you start, sorting all of those, and you get your full color pie. And we'll get to this when we talk about, fairness and balance and everything. But to make sure that you have your full core and everything is covered, and you don't leave anything unfair, you make sure that everything has answers, that everything is balanced in terms of cost and effect, but fair in terms of counters and answers and threats and things like that you can build. And there's other things that you would consider too, because we're designing a trading card game and we've set out, like the turn structure and all things like that. We need to make sure that we don't have any first turn wins, or any infinite combos, things that violate player agency. So those are all the things that we're starting to consider and how we're building out our game. And once we have that initial core of fully fleshed out mechanics sorted into our color pie, as we make new sets, we can build each new addition to the strategies that players have available fully by, again, considering making sure that each thing has answers to one another, that things aren't left unchecked, that things are all fair and mathematically and logically balanced in terms of cost and effect. So if you design something that doesn't have an answer, then you've created something that's unfair. And so now we've got the concern of medium and building out mechanics. One of the other things that's important to know is that at this point, you may be asking yourself, what are the limits? And the answer to that question is that there is infinite design potential, but the limits are how things can be realized. There are certain things that will break your game based on both the medium and the system you've set up based on that medium. So there are certain things that create, infinite combos. There are certain things that create breaks in Magic that don't have to just do with something like what's available in the card pool. Like if there isn't something to counter it, or if it creates a mechanic that works a certain way because of the card pool they haven't created a better rule for, or maybe they changed the wording of or something. There are things that happen due to how the system is built. So the 20 life that you have, or the number of cards that you start the game with in hand, these things can all give you boundaries for how to create mechanics. And another example here is, so in Mage War, the way that Mage War is built, unlike Magic the Gathering, because players can make their own cards, there are certain restrictions that have to be considered, because all of the mechanics need to be balanced no matter what you add to them on the card for other abilities. So one of the things that can't be done in Mage War to balance it and make things fair is the Magic mechanic of cheating things into play. So Mage War doesn't have a mechanic and can't have a mechanic and won't ever have a mechanic where you can like return a creature or an ally. It's in Mage War, it's an ally. Return an ally from your discard pile to play. In Mage War, the way that would happen is you would return it to your hand, and then you would have to pay its play cost again. But Magic is built differently, and so that doesn't break Magic. But there are other things that Mage War can do that Magic can't, like allowing players to build their own cards. So there are trade-offs in medium and how you apply medium to how your game will function, and it can be different within the same medium too. But the possibilities are infinite, and this is the next part of the discussion. I may come back to this in a future video, but here's where it's important to bring up power creep. So as we're expanding out our game, we're building successive rings that are complete, and we're making sure that each time we cover full customization of strategy, and we're staying to the standards of fairness and balance. In Magic, because the game is imbalanced, because the real game of Magic is imbalanced, not this theoretical version, what you get is a solved game, or a solved not game. It stops being a game. So it's imbalanced, it becomes a pay-to-win scheme. So that's bad power creep, and that's the way that all trading card games currently on the market are designed. They're all, you know, like these runaway train crashes that are slowly but surely running into all of these major problems that they create by designing a system where each successive ring outwards needs to create a greater and greater imbalance. You're still paying the same amount of mana, but you're getting more effect for the cost. And that's bad power creep, because that creates problems like, for example, in the majority of Magic formats, I'm pretty sure at this current time, in this day and age, the few exceptions, or at least the one exception that immediately jumps to mind, I think, is Standard. I think basic lands are obsolete in most formats of Magic the Gathering at this point, which is a really weird thing to think about. I don't know how much documentation there is on that, or how much talk there is, or whether the design team recognizes this or knows about it, but I'm pretty sure all basic lands are obsolete in every format except for Standard and maybe, I don't know where Pauper is at, but that's one of the canaries in the coal mine. Is like, you get to the point where you're questioning whether basic lands are obsolete in Pauper, you've run into a design problem. And so here's the counter to that. Here is good game design, where you aren't creating your own obsolescence and you aren't creating a game that's intended to become broken. As you build out those complexities, as you build out more and more options, what you're focusing on is options. Good power creep is an increase in complexity, an increase in the number of options players have to customize their strategy. That's what we're doing. We're not building out new strategies that are more imbalanced. If things create new mechanics, that's different. That's where you address it in terms of answers. That's how you make that fair. Creating new mechanics may seem like you're creating power creep because those interactions maybe didn't exist before, but it's not power creep if it's balanced, if it's fair. If it's actually theory compliant, what you're doing is you're increasing the number of options for full customization of strategy. That's the difference. So that is the simple look at applied game design for medium, or applying game design to medium. Now we can talk more a little about innovation, but we're gonna, get more to this, I think, in future videos, because these are all topics that can be expanded upon. But for innovating new designs, again, you're manipulating medium, and we can, like, a simple way to look at this is the real world examples we have of going from early game consoles like the Super Nintendo to more modern like Xbox and PlayStation layouts. And the shift from, so it works either way for 2D or 3D. So I think the ideal controller for 2D games is the Super Nintendo controller. And we can talk more about that later. But when you get to 3D games, it's interesting to see that designers really did realize there was an ideal design for 3D games. When you can, when the intent is to control movement on all axes, you need two separate joysticks. You need a 4-button layout, and for shoulder buttons, I think at the minimum you need one each. Now, PlayStation obviously has two on each side. I think Xbox standard has one on each side. But what's interesting about this is that's the medium you're playing in, is the controller, is how many controller ports are on the console. That's what the game boils down to, is you're interacting with that medium to play. So this increases portability. Whereas in the Super Nintendo era, it was almost impossible to port a game in full fidelity from Sega Genesis to Super Nintendo. And that is strictly because of the difference in button layout. It's just a medium question. But now that games have matured, not necessarily games, but console design has matured, it's realized that now that we've been doing this for long enough, and at least they've focused, because I think they've settled sort of on 3D design, it like the market needed to standardize in some way, and so they figured out the most reliable and the most accessible way to play 3D games is with this button layout, and I fully agree. I think that's that's the ideal. I think there could still be maybe like an ergonomics question, like what's the ideal controller? Is it PlayStation or Xbox? Personally, for me, this is my opinion. I think PlayStation, like the DualShock controller, is the ideal design, but I'm fully open to arguments for the Xbox one. But you can see this mirrored too in like the Switch controls, and I don't know if they're like I think you get like Steam, like the Steam engine controller kind of does this too. And again, there's a reason for this, because that's what you need to play 3D games. When you try to play something like Star Fox on Super Nintendo, the designers, and I don't agree with this choice, but they chose to fully eliminate the Z-axis. So you're so Fox's ship is on rails. It's moving it at well, actually, it's not always a constant velocity, but you're moving on rails. There's no way to ultimately control where the ship is headed. So even though you can get like little boosts, all you're concerned with for movement is the D-pad, up, down, left, and right. Now, if you're playing on the N64, it's unfortunate that you're still on rails in Star Fox 64, because other N64 games did this correctly. If you only can control one, like if you only have one movement control, because you're on the N64 controller, your hand is either on the D-pad or the joystick. You don't have both at the same time, because there's not two joysticks. I think a good example is like Diddy Kong Racing, where when you're flying, you're moving at a constant velocity, but you can still have full control with just one direction, like one axis control. This partially eliminates the z-axis. You're not on rails, you're just moving at a constant velocity, so you can still turn around and go backwards, but and you can boost and you can brake. So it solves that problem of not needing two joysticks, and it gets around that. But I think a more interesting way, if you were designing a 3D game with 2D controls, is doing something like Mario Kart, where you're eliminating the, basically I think like the y-axis. So you're moving on a flat plane. You can still, have hills and things like that, and you can even, do jumps. But all you need is just the D-pad, because really, I mean, if you're moving at a constant velocity, then you just need left and right. You almost don't need front and back. You would need that on something like Diddy Kong Racing if you had multiple vehicles, which would be great. But that's only if your game includes that. So getting more to game innovation for medium. Again, the way that you innovate is medium. So I think two examples for arcade cabinets that really jump out to me is the Mech Warrior arcade cabinets and the Initial D cabinets. And I love the way that these are designed. So in Mech Warrior, you get to sit in the cockpit, and the screen, so like it's fully blacked out, the screen makes it look like you're actually controlling the mech in the fight. And you've got all these control panels that are fully functional, like keypads that you can punch in, that control all of your functions, like your radar, your sensors, all your different weapon systems. You actually have control panels for all of this, and that's such a cool idea. There's some other arcade cabinets that do this too. I think there's like an early tank fighter game. I think one of them got developed for like a Bradley vehicle trainer for like the U.S. Army, maybe, or like the Marines or something. I don't know. I think maybe the Marines, but yeah, it's like a tank simulator. So you've got all these like tank controls on it, and that is a very interesting way to look at arcade cabinet design, moving away from a simple, joystick button layout. Now, yes, it's more expensive to develop that, but you can create a new experience for players that way. The Initial D cabinet does something really cool where it actually lets you have save games, basically. And it does this with this kind of card output, where when you play the game, when you're done with your play, it'll actually output a little trading card with your card, or with your car printed on it, and it'll print your progress. And each time you play Initial D, the trading card has a magnetic strip on the back with information, so you can stick it in there, and it has all your car information saved and your progress. So as you play, you make new progress, you increase like all the stats on your car. When it outputs your card at the end of that play, it'll have the new progress printed on it. It's really cool. I think more, arcade cabinets should take notice of things like that. Like having a save game on an arcade cabinet is an insane concept. That would be so cool to have more of, but we don't. So that's something. But you can look at this even more simply too. You don't have to like redesign the actual console. You could think of it too like adapting existing things that people haven't thought of. So let's look at like something like the Game Boy. There haven't been, I think there's maybe at least one or two games that they made where you can pull out the game, put in another one, and it uses that data somehow to generate content for the game. So like you pull out the other cartridge, you put back in your game, and it just had to use what was saved in RAM to run that system, and then it loops you back into the game, reading from your main cartridge. And this is something kind of like the PlayStation Monster Rancher game where you created monsters by putting in other game discs. You could, like you paused your game, you opened up your PlayStation, you put in another game disc, and the Monster Rancher game was still running, and it read data from other game discs to create monsters. That's something really cool that, I mean, wouldn't have been possible on the original Game Boy because there was like a power lock on the cartridge. That's what the little notch is. But, uh, Game Boy Pocket forward, like we could have had games that could, utilize other, like whatever other cartridges you had. That would have been so cool. Another thing is like, um, I don't know if this is possible based on how the contrast dial is wired to the screen, but if there's a register you can control for the contrast dial to manipulate that, it would have been really cool to have a Game Boy game like Predator or something where you have like Predator vision, and instead of the contrast dial changing the contrast on the Game Boy screen, it cycled through like different sensor arrays or like different like sensor ranges. And then you could still have full function of your start and select button to expand the playability of your Game Boy game. Um, and that's not even adding a new peripheral. That's just like reprogramming one of the dials on the Game Boy. And I don't think I've ever seen a game that did that, which either indicates that it wasn't possible or that just nobody did it. It's always possible nobody did it, and it is possible. Like, you see people doing a bunch of crazy stuff with Game Boy hacking nowadays. You wonder why more of those ideas weren't explored earlier. But like that's one of those. And that's kind of how you want to think about how to use medium to create new ideas. And we'll get to this in this future topic here. So I'll start kind of closing up our medium discussion so we can get to these future video topics here that I want to discuss. Because all of these tie into medium. And another example of this here is Mage War. I guess I'll talk more about this like in a future video talking about like the design process. But for Mage War, it answers the quest, or it answers the design question of how do you make a game where players can make their own game assets in a trading card game. And what was required was a point buy system. That's the way that you do that. But having trading card games leaves the space open for players to make their own things. And so that was something that I capitalized on in Logic, and that's what made that possible. Now, a lot more went into that, and there's a lot more to talk about the design process for that. And I kind of mentioned a couple of videos ago that that was many years in the making. But getting to these future video topics that are going to tie in back to medium. The first thing I want to get to is more just familiarizing yourself and practicing with the theorem by analyzing not games, and not just stopping once you find the first theory violation because then it's not a game, but making sure that you go through and fully each of the bullet points, going through the design and seeing all the breaks that are happening. And because the first break you notice may not be the main cause, it may be resulting from something else. And it's important to see those, to see both what the intent in design was, whether that was good or bad, and possibly how to fix it. And you'll start to see the design pitfalls that you don't want to run into for certain mediums and certain genres and ideas based on what's already been done. And this is going to help you practice getting ideas or just like making your workflow easier going through mechanics. Like you can already avoid certain pitfalls. But also coming up with new ideas for how you would fix things, what needs to be here. And in terms of innovation, once you fix certain things, other possibilities open up, and you won't see those possibilities until you explore how to approach things from a theory compliant standpoint. And getting to the next topic here, I've mentioned this before, I'm going to try and keep mentioning this over and over. Your mindset as a game designer needs to be that you are in an arms race with every other designer on the planet to give players the most fun possible. Because this is one of the things the theorem proves, players are the most important thing in game design. That's the entire point. That's why you're designing games in the first place, to give players an activity where they can have fun. Giving players the most fun possible in that activity is your goal. So that's I'm going to expand on that topic. We're going to talk about coming up with novel ideas, coming up with things that people have never done before, and why that's important, especially now that real game design is basically in its infancy. So there's a whole lot of reason to cover new ground, and that's what we're gonna talk about. In another video, I want to also go over some more basic things that I think starting game designers should know, and hopefully designers that are starting to design real games for the first time are already good at and aware of, is probabilities, and especially for tabletop design, why the 2d6 probability distribution is the most elegant. But I'm going to go through all of the different dice probabilities and how to use them. And we're also going to talk about video game design, the fact that sometimes you can use easier dice rolls like d4s, which you can't really use much in tabletop design. Those are a lot easier in video game design, but you also have more like timer-based things, like for the Game Boy, there's the timer register. That's how you get random numbers. You just jump in with an interrupt, and it cycles constantly from 0 to 255. So that timer in your Game Boy is just constantly running, and random number generators are just jumping in and pulling out a number from that timer to generate random numbers. And then, of course, there's also percentages, or in tabletop, we'd think of them as like D percentages. So we're going to go over all those, why they're important, and applying random number generators to mechanics design, things like that. Another major topic I want to cover is how real game design actually, like how the workflow actually goes. And the major headline here is, don't expect fast results. This is going to be addressing, and I hope healing, a lot of problems in what's expected in the idea of the modern game industry. I think there's a lot of expectations from investors and corporations for how game design is supposed to happen, certain time frames for things, their expectations, and those are all going to have to be adjusted, especially in terms of like investors. This is going to be a major shift in both their expectations and how they handle game designers. And this is because game design is not a fast process. It fundamentally cannot happen quickly. It's not something, and we're going to go through this whole thing. Working through ideas, and especially coming up with novel ideas, is a process that just needs to take time. It requires failure. And so these unrealistic, design cycles and pipelines and just this constant churning out of schlock that a lot of these companies are focused on needs to be readjusted, needs to be rethought, because that's just not how game design is going to happen. And they're going to continue not being able to design games because they keep, trying to just cut corners and push things through to production that don't qualify as being viable. So we're going to go through that. Don't expect fast results, and how to design games, what the actual process is, and like what things are taking time and how ideas are being worked through. And then the last idea here I have for the video topics, and there may be even additional things in between these. I don't know even what order they're going to be in, but this last idea is talking about how to come up with novel ideas, because writer's block is a problem in every creative field. It's not unique to writing. You know, architects, painters, comic book illustrators, script writers, everybody gets writer's block. Game designers too. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of this happens when you try and deviate from thinking about medium. But a lot of this too is when you're when like either when you have an idea and you're thinking, what's the best medium to do this in? Or whether you're starting with a medium and trying to figure out, what can I do with this? There's a whole lot of time you can waste trying to figure out those ideas, or pursuing ideas that don't have value. And so I'm going to try and share some of my, tips and tricks, and more commentary on game theory and how to make the process of coming up with novel ideas and good ideas easier and faster. Because game design is already a slow process, even with these things. So we're going to either talk about those two topics together or maybe separately. I think I'm going to try and separate them, but those are the ideas for upcoming topics, and that is it for this video. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned a few things, and I hope you're excited for whatever's coming up. I am too. I will see you in the next video.